Manchester City are usually on another level compared to their opponents. That's all thanks to the mastermind behind this team, Pep Guardiola. Pep has managed to win important trophies at every club he's managed. In fact, just recently, his team completed a domestic treble and in process became the Premier League champions for a second time in a row, which might have had something to do with him winning the Premier League Manager of the Year award. So, what does he do so differently that gives his team the advantage over their opponents more often than not? Well, the key is in his basic principles. And paradoxically, it's the same basic principles that make City so complicated to play against. Fittingly, in this video, we're going to figure out what really sets City apart by first covering the basic principles that form the core of Pep's philosophy, and then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty details that expand on those principles and provide a full picture of what goes on inside Pep's mind. Although, to be fair, there aren't many teams that can match the financial might of Manchester City. However, Pep still has much to do after taking advantage of those financial resources. And that's exactly what we will be focusing on in this video. To begin, we'll explore Pep's mindset when his team are in possession, as that specifically plays a crucial role in how City operate without the ball. That said, let's take a look at some of the principles of Pep's philosophy. Every player stays positionally disciplined throughout the match. Use full width of the pitch. The whole team moves as a unit, whether attacking or defending. Maintain as much possession as possible. As you can see, none of this is too complicated, and you would expect a considerable number of coaches to share similar principles. But the key difference that sets Pep apart is how he combines these basic principles with his ingenuity. For example, Pep played Zinchenko as an inverted fullback against United. In case you're wondering, an inverted fullback or a false fullback is a player who during the build-up plays almost as a center midfielder just ahead of the center backs. This allows the midfielders to venture forward a bit more than usual. Now, when you combine this with his principles, the results can be devastating for the opposition. Notice how Zinchenko's position drags Young out of position. Right after that, David Silva spots Sterling, who's holding his position, ready to exploit the space Young left behind him. Pep specifically targeted that side with Zinchenko's role since Young was arguably the weakest link in United's defense. Overall, Zinchenko's role often played a significant part in City's build-up play against United. Notice how Zinchenko's position keeps Rashford inside, creating space for Laporte out wide. And if Rashford was to press Laporte out wide, then either Fernandinho or Zinchenko would exploit the gaps left in the middle to play through United. There were many more similar instances that I could have included. However, none of this would be possible if Zinchenko wasn't disciplined enough to follow the plan exactly as Pep wanted him to. Notice how, since Zinchenko is not present where he should be, David Silva gets trapped and almost loses possession. This brings us back to the first principle. Every player stays positionally disciplined throughout the match. Meanwhile, the second principle is pretty self-explanatory, as using the full width of the pitch gives City more space to play with. But it also forces the opposition to make a move, especially in the final third. In this example, the fullback stays back and allows Mahrez to come up uncontested, because if he was to close Mahrez down, Bernardo Silva would be left wide open to exploit the wing, with David Silva providing another option inside. On the other hand, if the fullback decides to close down the wide player, City can exploit the space in behind in an instant. Basically, it forces the opposition to stretch out, which is bound to create gaps for City to exploit, among other things. Now, the importance of the third principle cannot be overstated. Pep wants his team to operate as a unit in offense as well as in defense. Of course, that's not always possible, and I'll go over how Pep deals with that once we explore his defensive mindset a bit later in the video. For now, we're focusing on why Pep wants his team to play as a unit, whether they attack or defend, with the exemption of counterattacks, of course. So let's take a look at a few examples. Right after winning possession, City look to counter, but as soon as it's clear that it's a lost cause, they slow down until they're comfortably moving the ball around. And right after they have it under control, the whole team moves up as a unit. Not only does that allow everyone to play closer to each other, which of course means easier distribution of the ball, but it also makes it easier to gegenpress, which is a key component of Pep's defensive philosophy. On top of that, they're really careful to not overextend themselves. When David Silva finds Zinchenko on left wing, Zinchenko immediately passes it back to David Silva, while dragging the nearby United player who was putting pressure on David Silva. Zinchenko didn't have to go back as he could have passed it to Sterling with a forward pass, but then City would be limited in terms of further options, while United would have had a better chance to dispossess. Lastly, the fourth principle requires the team to maintain as much possession as possible. This is one of the main reasons why Pep wants the build-up play to include his goalkeeper. In fact, Pep's obsession with playing from the back actually encapsulates all four of his principles in a beautiful way. And now that you're familiar with the principles, let's dive right into the details. Pep loves to build up from the back because it provides his team a distinct advantage that cannot be found anywhere else on the field. In order to create that advantage, Pep has his center backs drop back on either side of the goalkeeper, while both fullbacks stay wide by the sideline on their respective sides, with a defensive midfielder in the middle. This makes it 6 players for City in their own third versus potentially 5 opposition players if the opponent presses high. So it's safe to say that more often than not, City have a man advantage when they build up from the back. This allows them to play around the initial wave of pressure, which is often enough to get them out of their own third. And every so often, if they exploit the gaps quick enough, they can get into advanced positions that they might have not gotten into originally if the opponent didn't press that high. As you saw, Pep has a very specific set of rules that he expects everyone to follow. His goal is to have the whole team on the same page. It's because he knows that even if one player strays away from his plan, the whole system is at risk of falling apart. Pep wants his players to stay in their positions and trust their teammates' passing abilities, because every player has a purpose behind their movement. He does not want his players going out of their way trying to help their teammates, because that affects the whole system. Notice how Fred's position could have made it difficult for City to mark everyone, while United would have had a way out. This is why it's so crucial to have everyone on the same page. It's rare to see City players not being on the same page when in possession, and even then it's still manageable. The system becomes vulnerable when it happens while his team is defending, because Pep's style of play basically compels the opposition to play in a counter-attacking fashion for the most part. Quick note before we explore Pep's defensive mindset. City have spent the most time in opposition's third and least in their own third. Having an overwhelming majority of possession in basically every game definitely helps to maintain that. With Pep wanting his team moving as a unit, it makes sense why his teams are always playing with such a high line. So it's safe to say that counterattacks are much more threatening to Pep than any other type of play. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons why Klopp, thanks to his counter-attacking style of play, is the only manager with a win percentage over 50% when going against Pep. No other manager even comes close to matching this. We will not be focusing on how Klopp achieved this, at least in this video, maybe some other time. That said, over the past few years, Pep has had a chance to perfect a contingency plan that deals with this exact issue of counterattacks. And I would say that plan has been pretty effective, considering City did not concede a goal from a counterattack in the Premier League throughout the whole season. So let's take a look at what the contingency plan is all about. The first point of action as soon as they lose the ball is to gegenpress and try to regain possession. Notice how quickly City cut out any nearby options while closing down the player on the ball. If the opponent manages to play through their press, they will most likely try to go towards the wings. This is due to Pep's persistence on his fullbacks being significantly advanced on their respective wings. And so, City's priority switched to isolating the player on the wing as soon as a pass is made out wide. This usually slows down the counter-attack, which gives them some time to get back in shape, but not always. It's really difficult for City to slow down the play during a counter if the opponent is able to move the ball quickly. That's why if there's any indication that the opponent has a good opportunity to counter, Pep wants his team to do whatever it takes to stop the attack before it's too late. When gegenpressing or isolating a player on the wing is not enough, Pep is left with only one option: tactical foul. Now, I know Pep tried to distance himself from this, but it's actually an integral part of his contingency plan, so I can't skip it. Hear me out. I'm aware there are statistics that show that City don't commit that many fouls compared to other teams in the Premier League. And according to those same statistics, their fouls per game is one of the lowest in the league, along with Chelsea and Liverpool. However, those statistics don't take into account how little time the opposition has the ball throughout the whole match. Notice the significant difference between City spending time without the ball compared to Chelsea and Liverpool. Also, notice how there's a bigger difference between first and second position than any other two consecutive positions throughout the whole league. It's clear that City are an outlier when it comes to possession. So when you look at how often City fouls compared to how much time they actually spend without the ball, it becomes clear that City are one of the worst offenders in the Premier League by a huge margin. And it goes under the radar because Pep is smart about it. The thing with tactical fouls is that you cannot do it regularly, and especially close to your own box, because that will result in a booking almost every time. To get around that issue, Pep tasks his wide offensive players to pursue the player on the ball and bring him down by force if necessary. This is why Sterling, Bernardo Silva, and David Silva are second, third, and fourth respectively in terms of most fouls committed by a City player this season. Essentially, City are content with committing a foul high upfield, which usually gives them enough time to get back in shape. But if they're not able to stop the counter, Fernandinho is tasked to step in and do whatever is necessary before it gets out of their hands. Usually, it's stuff like him going by the sideline to cover for a player out of position. But every now and then, he has no other option but to commit a tactical foul if he wants to stop that attack. No wonder why he tops the list of most fouls committed by a City player this season. All this makes it so the opponent has to pass through so many barriers before they even get into the final third. On top of that, if the opponent tries to exploit the high line with the ball over the top, Ederson as a sweeper keeper is often able to intercept and handle the situation. For time's sake, I won't be getting into how City defend against open play attacks. In case you're curious, I have gone over that in my previous videos on Manchester City. There's not much more to Pep's defensive mindset other than all that. That said, now that we have a decent grasp on Pep's philosophy, I'm sure most of you have figured it out by now. Those basic principles we discussed earlier are essentially the building blocks for every Pep Guardiola team. On top of that, they actively play a vital role in every tweak made by Pep to adapt his tactics to better fit the opposition. So let's explore how he builds up on those principles, which makes his team so tricky to play against. One of the most important things for Pep is to create overloads in specific parts of the field. That usually provides his team with an easy route to play through the opponent's shape. To make that possible in the first place, Pep has two of his midfielders play a unique role, with his center forward playing as a false nine. David Silva is usually one of the midfielders playing the unique role. The other midfielder spot depends on what Pep has in mind for the opposition. So it could be either De Bruyne or Bernardo Silva. And if Bernardo plays on the right wing, Gundogan can also take his place in the midfield. Now let's talk a bit about that unique role I mentioned earlier. Both midfielders are mostly free to roam around, but are tasked to stay near their half space until they get into the opponent's half. Then they're supposed to get involved on a regular basis as they move around with the ball. Meanwhile, the center forward's false nine role requires him to drop deep into the midfield and assist in the build-up, as opposed to staying by the defensive line. This puts the opposition in a situation where no matter what they do, at least one City player is always left open. David Silva in half space occupies Sissoko, but Mendy, being uncontested when receiving a pass, drags the marker away. Meanwhile, Agüero's false nine role allows for a pass upfield. City essentially created a triangle with Sissoko in between, so Mendy could have gone to either player who would have been able to find each other afterwards as well. Basically, midfielders, along with the false nine, are responsible for disrupting the opponent's shape, which they do either through their movement or by creating overloads that usually target the wide areas. Let's take a look at midfielders using their movement to disrupt opponent's shape. Fernandinho is limited considering United's forwards are right on him. A few seconds later, we can see that Fred has to cut out the passing lane to Agüero while marking David Silva. David Silva also figures that out, so he nonchalantly drops into the gap between Lingard and Fred with no intention to play through United just yet. This causes Lingard to close him down since Fred was concerned with cutting passing lane to Agüero. And now that Lingard's out of the way, Fernandinho has plenty of time and space to move the ball around. City's build-up play is a constant barrage of plays like these until they reach the final third. That is where the offensive players gain even more freedom. Notice how City's whole offense is pretty much compressed on the right wing. Let's take a closer look because there's a lot going on in that part of the field. Pogba's marking Walker and Gundogan, but since Walker goes up uncontested, Pogba has to go to him. Meanwhile, Agüero comes inside, and with no one to mark him, Fred cannot worry about Gundogan and is dragged to the center forward. Now, United have all of their players occupied, while City have 2 players left open. Because his team can get so compressed, Pep prefers to have a pacey winger play on the left. The winger on the far side usually stays near the sideline because, as we all know by now, Pep wants to use the full width of the pitch. This is so important to him because by just having a player stay in the half space while City switch to the other side, they can put the opponent's fullback in a lose-lose situation. Either the fullback tries to close down the winger, but will leave a huge gap for the player in half space to exploit, or take care of the player in half space, but leave the winger wide open on the wing. In fact, City actually scored their second goal through the same tactic that allowed them to score their first. I hope it's clear how Pep manages to have his teams play beautiful football on a regular basis. For starters, the intricate movement and passing can be attributed to being on the same page and following the same principles. In the following example, there isn't anything too complicated going on, just teammates playing in tandem with each other. David Silva makes a run and drags Wanyama away from the midfield in process. Meanwhile, Agüero sees an opening and exploits the newly created space. However, the complicated stuff we discussed earlier definitely helps Pep stand out from the rest. His greatest strength comes from the cohesion of his tactics along with his principles that he's so dependent on. But there are a few valid reasons why he deserves to be criticized. First of all, Pep hasn't been able to meet expectations in the Champions League ever since he took over a treble-winning Bayern Munich from Jupp Heynckes. On top of that, it's disappointing for most people, I'm sure for Pep as well, to not see City perform like they're expected to, especially after investing so much in top players. Besides that, he can be criticized for his over-reliance on tactical fouls. But looking at it from a different perspective, he's just using everything at his disposal to give his side an advantage. And honestly, I can't really blame him for that. If anyone's to blame, it's the referees and people behind the scene with the power to change rules surrounding the controversial aspect of this sport. As a fan of this beautiful game, I don't like to see tactical fouls, or dives for that matter. But as a student of this sport, I appreciate Pep for doing everything he can to win. I just don't appreciate him feigning ignorance and lying with a straight face. But I'd probably do the same considering the backlash one can get if not outright denied. So who am I to talk? I would just like to say that if you enjoyed the video, feel free to express your support in whatever way you feel most comfortable with. Sharing it anywhere helps the most. I'll be leaving a comment down below for whoever wants more details regarding the future of my channel because I don't want to make this video any longer than it has to be.